Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I've been able to participate for the last, since the lunch session, and the last panel was wonderful. I realized it became a couple of speeches as opposed to a panel, so I propose to return some of the time to the audience by speaking less and then opening it up, because I'm sure people will have a lot of comments, and I'd be fine if my prior panelists responded as well if they wish to. As the introduction suggested, I spent all my life, I'm basically trained as a mathematician, looking for interesting problems to think about. And most of the problems that I've been working on for the last 10 or 15 years in developing countries around the world are essentially social problems to which you can bring a business mindset and try to create a sustainable business model solution to it. That sort of defines the kinds of work that I do. For me, my hometown of New Delhi, which is where I was born, is a laboratory where I try different things, and I think Manish's presentation makes clear why there are ample opportunities for treating places like India or China. I'm particularly fond of doing experiments in rural China as opposed to the main cities, but in places like this, if you think of them as experimental petri dishes, you can come up with all sorts of neat things that have relevance everywhere else. So what I thought I'd share with you are some examples that are front and center in my mind as I think through and work through these problems. The other thing I'm fond of doing is I like to start companies. I've started several companies, mostly in Asia. You know, like any entrepreneur, most of these fail, but some have worked out pretty well. And the thing that I'm particularly happy about is that they all have a social footprint to them, and they generate a lot of jobs and do good things. And as an academic, mostly what's interesting is that they generate a lot of data. Not quite 60 million households, as Manish was saying, but a lot of micro data on various interesting things on which you can do some more research. And completing that virtuous cycle is very satisfying to me in many ways, and an approach that I advocate with enthusiasm to anybody. So I thought what I would do is I would take you through a few examples that I find interesting to think about, and suggest some general principles that emerge from them for the way that at least I think about emerging markets, and illustrate them just in the interest of brevity. As I just indicated, I spent a lot of time in rural China, speaking enough rudimentary Mandarin to get me around, not really enough, but enough to, with my students, to make sure I'm getting the real picture. But what I want to do is focus on examples from China and India, because I think that they are just about as far apart from each other on a couple of interesting dimensions, so that you sort of span some very interesting spaces, and you can learn from two very different contextual petri dishes in some sense. And as any social scientist would know, you want to expand the sources of variation to try to get at at the true structure of some underlying problem. Let me see how this works. Anyone tell me what that is? You can shout it out. Yeah, it's a beating heart, right? And those two calipers are just immobilizing a piece of heart tissue so that somebody can operate on the interim while the heart keeps beating. And the advantage of this, of course, is that you don't have to immobilize the entire heart muscle and put the patient on a complicated heart-lung machine, which in any case will only preserve the heart tissue for 45 minutes or 60 minutes at most, after which you start to get some incipient damage. And it takes enormous skill to operate on a beating heart. Now, I discovered an interesting statistic comparing a hospital run by a very close friend of mine, Narayan Hospitals in Bangalore, that at that hospital, 80% of what surgeons call CABG surgeries, coronary artery bypass graft, CABG abbreviated, that 80% of CABG surgeries in that hospital in Bangalore are done on this beating heart. It turns out to be much cheaper to do it this way than to have a very complicated piece of capital equipment, a heart-lung machine. I don't know if I have a picture of it. Yeah, that's a heart-lung machine on the left. So you can see many things can go wrong in a heart-lung machine. But doing 80% of surgeries like this, in contrast to the hospital down the street from where I live in Boston, Mass General, where 20% are done in this way. So if you are unfortunate, if you suffer an unfortunate event like a heart attack, and you go to Mass General, which is what I would do if I had my heart attack in Boston, very likely my heart would be immobilized on a heart-lung machine, whereas if it happened to me in Bangalore, somebody would operate on the fly. Now, all my students who are chief medical officers at various Harvard hospitals in these programs that I teach, come by and assure me that what the surgeons in Bangalore are doing is very risky. But the point of view that I think I'm evolving towards is that risk is in the mind of the beholder in some sense, which is once you've done, there's a very famous popular book by the New Yorker writer Malcolm Gladwell, right, who says that to be an expert, to be world-class in anything, you have to do it for 10,000 hours. Right? So that's sort of a rough principle that I like a lot, because the surgeons in Bangalore are doing many very complicated procedures, including cabbage procedures. 10,000 hours doesn't take them too long to get to that level of excellence. The gentleman who started the Bangalore hospital, I don't want to push this off the podium by accident, the gentleman who started the Bangalore hospital says, his name is Devi Shetty, he says that in London when he operated, he would do certain procedures a couple of times a month, whereas in Bangalore he does it 3 or 4 times a day. So you can see the frequency of doing this thing is quite extraordinary. Now the reason that India is a sensible petri dish for the innovations that are necessary for them to do this with a very high degree of precision and certainty that cannot be matched even at Mass General today, the reason is contextual ultimately, which is the spirit of the examples that the 2 panelists before were giving us also. And the particular contextual circumstances that are relevant here is that sadly for the Indian and Indian-looking people in the room, we have pretty bum hearts. We're not bad people, we just have bad hearts, as in like bad heart tissue, which genetically predisposed to these diseases. And so we get heart disease all the time. And there's a lot of us. There's a lot of us Indians, South Asians running around, so a combination of extreme poverty, bad diet, low exercise, genetic predisposition to disease, and not inadequate medical services means that there's a line of people standing outside the hospital waiting for treatment. So it's a scale issue in a sense, in a similar sense. But the numbers are truly staggering. Let me show you. So in a study that a couple of my PhD students are doing, we're trying to sort of do apples to apples comparisons. In other words, identify particular procedures that are done sufficiently frequently at both hospitals so that you can do some statistical tests. So this is comparative mortality numbers for a particular procedure for illustrative purposes. The cabbage procedure I talked about. At Narayan hospitals, 1.4% of people die over some defined and agreed upon time horizon that's common across these hospitals. And below that, I arrayed the comparable mortality rates at some of the leading hospitals in the US, and you could have a long list. Essentially, it's roughly the same. It's pretty good, and the numbers are better or as good as virtually all US hospitals. But the catch is that if you do risk-adjusted mortality, in other words, you control for the complexity of the input patient pool, in an unscientific sense, I would say, and I'm trying to do this a bit more carefully, in an unscientific sense, I'd say that the input patient pool is maybe 10 times more complicated. Why? Because by the time the poor person comes to the door of Narayan hospitals, he's on his last legs. I say he because it's usually a male, unfortunately for me. He's on his last legs because he's typically poor. He can't find his way to the hospital. He doesn't know what to do. He's behaviorally predisposed not to seek care in a fancy-looking hospital. And most important, he lacks time. In other words, he's a day laborer. And so the prospect of being away from his job means that his family doesn't get fed. So he won't come. So when you look at the heart tissue under a microscope, it looks like somebody had taken a machete and scrambled it. And then you're asking the surgeon to patch it together. Whereas if you look at the same tissue under a microscope at the median Mass General patient, it's probably somebody like me who had the good fortune of good doctors, or somebody detects a tiny murmur and says, you better go get it fixed. Right? Very different ball game, very different. But despite that, the numbers are similar, right? Plus, it's 5% of the cost. Right? So $100,000 surgery, 5% is actually being very charitable to the US hospitals. It's more like 2%. And at the rate that we're going now, it should be about 1% or 0.7% soon. In other words, we should be able to do a cabbage surgery for $700 on a very complicated patient pool with better mortality numbers than anybody else. And no patient is ever turned away. So these numbers are after you account for the fact that more than half the people are subsidized. So this is a pretty staggering difference. Now, in a sense, I'm sorry, some of my economist friends may be around. We often talk about sort of labor substituting innovations. Yeah? That you take capital equipment and you substitute it with cheap labor. Well, in a sense, that's what it is. You're taking the capital equipment, like the heart-lung machine, and you're substituting it by labor. But it's a very different kind of labor. This is highly skilled labor. So the presumption that the labor substitution is low end is perhaps a presumption that, that deserves a little bit of revisiting, particularly in something as complicated as this. So what I want you to take away from this is very simple. It's just that, as the previous panelists also suggested, the locus of innovation has changed. Right? It's everywhere. And that's a good thing for the entire world. It's a good thing because you're essentially maximizing the variation in experimental settings. And that's good. That can't be a bad thing. That just can't be a bad thing from the standpoint of, an economist would say, social welfare. Right? Goodness in the world is increased if experiments are run in different places. The second thing I find very interesting is what we can learn from it in this country. Right? So let me wear the hat of a professor at a US institution. I started speaking about this particular example. This hospital started, I don't know, in the early 2000s. It's less than 10 years old. So think about that. It's the world's best center of pediatric cardiac surgery. It didn't exist. The place where it is built was a dusty field. It still is a dusty area in Bangalore, less than 10 years ago. And it's now the best center of pediatric cardiac surgery in the world, bar none. But I started talking about this at Harvard maybe 6 years ago. And I think it's fair to say I was laughed out of the room by everybody when I showed some of these numbers, because nobody would believe them. It just seemed too implausible that you're talking about tertiary heart surgery on tiny babies, so neonatal cases, babies that are this big, right, with hearts that are barely developed, and this is the place where you get them fixed the best in the world. It just seems mind-boggling to anybody. But about 3-4 years ago, in the power of the media, I don't know if I have that picture here. Yes, so the Wall Street Journal published this article, essentially saying that I was right, calling this gentleman, who was the protagonist, the Henry Ford of heart surgery. Right? Now, the Henry Ford is a good comparison because it's the first attempt to mass produce something. It's just that here we're talking about mass producing something fairly complicated. Mass producing the repairing of life in some ways, right? I might, sticking to the auto analogies, I might have used Toyota as much because a lot of what's really going on is tiny improvements every day. Yeah? Tiny improvements. A simple example would be surgeons in adjacent operating rooms can see each other when they're operating, which is nice because if you're stuck, you can wave, and the guy runs over and helps you. Nothing wrong with it. And the operating room has sunlight in it. I've never seen an operating room that has sunlight anywhere in the world. And the simple reason for that is that the surgeons do better jobs if they have pipe music. So you ask the surgeon, what do you like to hear? Some guy says rock and roll. Somebody says Mahler's Ninth. Someone says the sitar. And so you provide that, and productivity goes up. So these tiny things. Or you get better sutures, which are infinitely cheaper, but don't break when you're doing mass surgeries, and so on and so on and so forth. I should say that all the equipment in this hotel is better than the equipment down the street where I live. So there's no capital equipment difference. If anything, it's better in this place. The inspiration for this, by the way, comes from Mother Teresa and Walmart. Those are the two inspirations. Right? Mother Teresa, because this guy was a volunteer for Mother Teresa for a few years before she died, and so was motivated to do some social service. And Walmart, because standing in a parking lot, he thought, and I agreed with that, well, if you have so many people coming in buying stuff and it becomes cheaper, why can't we just do the same thing for surgeries? It's just a mindset block, right, that prevents you from thinking like that. So I was going to say that now we've evolved from. So the general version of what I want you to think about is we are sitting, as the beneficiaries of much largesse in this society. There's opulence aplenty around here, right? But there's also waste aplenty around here. And more than that, there's sort of underutilized brain cycles in our head for the most part that confronted with something interesting, and this includes myself and my eminent colleagues at Harvard, are unable to process the likelihood of something happening somewhere else, right? So the American medical system has been quite reluctant to embrace something like this. If I weren't worried about being sued, I might say it's even an obstructionist. So I won't say that. But it's been very hard to try this experiment here. Purely by chance, one of my students last year was a very senior person at Mass General. And so he's taken it upon himself to initiate a study to actually nail down what's going on in this particular example and see what we can learn from it. So hopefully we make some progress. But because we're not allowed to open a hospital on the mainland, we've decided to open a hospital in the Cayman Islands, which is, I don't know, 30, 40-minute flight from Miami, so that anybody can come to Miami, and we'll have, I hope, a free air taxi that'll operate your heart and send you back. And that'll be much cheaper. Who do you think in the United States is most happy about this? Anybody? Who's the happiest about the observation that there will be a dramatically cheaper way to get heart surgery done? Go ahead, shout it out. Insurance companies. Smart lady. Insurance companies are our best friends. So guess what's going to happen in a tornado in the next 5 years? The insurance companies are going to put huge amounts of pressure as we progressively bankrupt ourselves with our current healthcare system. Huge amounts of pressure to say, you ought to start doing this. Instead of reimbursing $60,000 for cabbage, we're going to start reimbursing $30,000. You go do whatever you want. Right? So the point I'm trying to make is that A, something neat happens somewhere else in an unlikely place. That's point B. B, sitting over here, we're reluctant to embrace it. C, nonetheless, when the economics are sufficiently compelling and the need sufficiently dire, that some mechanism will exist to break down the barriers. And it's sort of like, what's that old poem, King Canute, standing and, telling the waves, go back, go back. It's like the waves are coming, you can't push them back. What's the poem? Anyone know the poem, King Canute? That guy's, remember it? Remember the name? No, you don't remember. Very famous poem for anybody interested in English literature. Okay. Quick general point on emerging markets. So at the heart of this organization, I didn't mean to have a pun, but at the heart of this organization is an idea, scalable heart surgery, right? But to actually make it happen in the emerging market, so many other things had to be done, right? To compensate for infrastructural limitations in that particular setting, in this case in India, right? One, I'll just rush through this. Insurance markets had to be created. Literally had to be created from the ground up. So today, 50 to 60, I forget the numbers, is directionally correct, 50 to 60 million poor farmers are insured for the princely sum of $3 a year. For $3 a year, you get access, guaranteed access to all forms of tertiary and primary health care. I neglected to mention that the heart example has been replicated in about 8 different specialties by the same group of people in the place. So you can be fully insured for $3 a year, right? Now, I often ask audiences, if I told you that this is the kind of place that this organization has reached, I should say I'm a pro bono advisor to this entity for a long time. So I don't want to make any money off it, but it's a fantastic example. But if I say, what you want to make a big impact, what would be the biggest goal that you would have? Anybody, what would be your biggest goal? If I described to you what I've described so far and said, we can do surgery for this price, right? And it's pretty good surgery. What goal would you advise these people to have going forward in the next 10 years? Somebody. Replicate everywhere. Do what is it? Complete the system everywhere. Okay. No, I think we want to do better. What we want to do is Walmartize healthcare worldwide. So make healthcare available to every citizen of the world, every person in the world for $1 a day. Complete healthcare coverage. Forget about all the budget stuff we're talking about. We want to do complete healthcare coverage in the next 10 years for everybody in the world. Now, I hear some chuckles and some disbelief. Well, that's exactly the reaction that people had 5 years ago when I started talking about this, so I don't care. And frankly, right now, we can do it in India for not $1 a day, $3 a year. $1 a day is $365 a year. We don't need $365. We need less than that technologically. Yeah? What we need is to break down the inertial, the legal, the litigation, the suing, the barriers to experimentation that are going to prevent this. That's really what we need. Right? I have no idea how we're going to do it. But I had no idea how we would get here 5 years ago either. Right? So it's fine. So coming back to this, we had to do insurance. We had to do telemedicine. Why telemedicine? Because this is all predicated on scale and learning, scale and learning, scale and learning, scale and learning. But for that, you need people to come to the hospital. But people can't come to the hospital because they're poor, they don't have time, they don't have money, they don't know where to go, etc. So we go to them with technology. Right? Now, it turns out that many countries around the world have been tossing these pieces of metal into the air to spy on each other, right? Satellites. And they're floating around mostly doing nothing. I'm exaggerating, but what I mean to say is that technologically there's so much spare capacity on the satellite that the marginal cost of accessing it for something incremental is zero. So we went and got spare capacity for zero price, which is a good thing that the governments did. And now we provide free telemedicine services to all 53 African capitals, diagnostic services, all tertiary diseases, completely free. And what's the cost to us? So, the doctor's time in Bangalore and in Delhi and a few other places, and that work of doctors, right? It's a nice thing. It's free. Capacity is free. You want a free ride on publicly available infrastructure when the cost to society is zero, because anything that you do is incrementally beneficial to everybody. So we had to do that. We had to pioneer telemedicine to bring people in it so that we could actually do scalable heart surgery. Right? What else? Medical education, social services, etc. Yeah? So many different things. So the general version of this is the following, that any good organization in an emerging market has to compensate for the absence of all the services that it needs to launch something. Yeah? So I put up an abstract thing. You need an idea. Yeah? What do you need? You need a bunch of stuff. You need, I put a bunch of bubbles up here that are completely arbitrary. You need logistics providers, auditors, arbitration services, risk capital, marketing agencies, consulting firms. Self-servingly, I said business schools on the top. I don't really believe it. Honestly, you don't really need business schools. It's nice when you have them. But you need a bunch of stuff to make that idea happen. Yeah? And my defining characteristic of emerging markets, so in all the talks today that I've been listening to, emerging markets are treated as just a homogeneous entity. So I prefer to have sort of almost a mathematically rigorous, clean, parsimonious definition of an emerging market. And my definition is to take the term emerging market seriously. In other words, any place where you have trouble bringing a buyer and seller together is an emerging market, right? Because the market hasn't emerged. The market is the thing that brings the buyer and seller together. And if you think about what you need to transact, you need essentially all these things, and then many more, and many more, and many more, and many more, right? So what we do in our work is basically come up with a laundry list, which is a taxonomy of different kinds of things that you would need to complete the market. And that provides a conceptual map for why the particular kind of emerging market in Bangalore is different from the one in Kinshasa, is different from the one in Sao Paulo, is different from the one in Joburg, et cetera. Yeah? And it's a Monday morning map, which is I want an entrepreneur to get up in the morning, look out of his or her window and say, yes, quickly I scan the environment. These are the particular institutional voids in our terminology, and this is how I go about countering them. Right? So that's the definition of emerging market that we adopt. And the particular versions of the institutional voids if you take a country like China and a country like India, are wildly different, wildly different. Right? So I want to see if we can convert this into a more interactive session. Is that okay? I can keep talking ad nauseum forever. I'm not sure that's the best use of harnessing the collective intelligence. So let me try to open it up and see if anybody wants to comment on this, or, those guys are there too. So let's convert this into a crowdsourced forum. How's that sound? Yeah? Anybody? Yeah, there's a lady there behind you.
This is Shivangini, and I wanted to know more about, while you try to venture into the emerging markets, the biggest problem we have is reaching the bottom of the pyramid, mainly the accessibility. Affordability can come with innovation, but how do you get access to those markets?
It's a great. Can I illustrate with an example, just for a second? And this relates to an example that Manish was alluding to in his presentation. Which is, he talked about IBM receiving 60,000 resumes in a week, month, something like that, and processing them. Well, if you just stick with that example, right? There are 350 million people in China who are completely cut off from the mainstream economy. there are, depending on how you count, maybe 700 million in India who are cut off from the mainstream economy. In my terminology, there's a massive set of institutional voids that disconnect them. In some sense, I think of each of these countries as being people in the mainstream economy, people not in the mainstream economy. So the thing that perplexes me all the time is how does one connect goods and services? But it has to be done profitably. Profitably. Not that I have anything against NGOs or people who want to do it with grants. More power to everybody who wants to do it in any way they want. But to my mind, the only way we're going to make a dent on this with this many billions of people is if there's a self-sustaining system. So here's an example in the same space. 3 years ago, as I said, I'm at Harvard, a mathematician. We came up with a nice algorithm. Basically, it searches faster than anything in the world, hands down. It just searches faster. And we said, let's now create an adaptive test. Adaptive in this jargon simply means it gets better as more people do it, right? Because you learn from the test. And then apply it to anything. So you can apply it to the spoken, speaking, how people speak. Can you hear them clearly enunciate, et cetera? You can apply it to logic, reasoning, math, counting, retail, home healthcare workers, microfinance workers, accounting, anything. And so we've created this company. There's 2 kids from MIT and myself, right? And we go to companies currently in India, but soon in other parts of the world. And we go to people and to companies and say, how many college campuses do you recruit at, right? So most people will correctly say, because it's not sensible for them to go and recruit at college campuses where the density of talent is not high enough. Most people would say 10 colleges, 20, 40, 100, 200 if they're being heroic and telling a white lie, right? But India itself has 25,000 colleges, right? Not counting those that are sort of semi-college-like entities. So my submission to them is to really get to the 300, 400, 500, 600 million who are completely out of it. Why don't we go to college number 19,632? And the answer is, it doesn't make sense because the cost of getting there is too much. You might find somebody there every other year, right? It's not worth it to go find the college, et cetera. But if I lower the cost of access to that individual asymptotically to 0, then of course you should get to it. So that's what we've done. We've lowered it to almost 0. So now we can go to big companies in India, right, and say, you want to hire 20,000 people a year, right? We will raise your efficiency of conversion from input to hiring by, I don't know, an order of magnitude at least, if not 2 orders of magnitude. Yeah? We'll lower your pain point so dramatically, yeah? And you pay us based on results. It's free. You pay us on results. Or you search our databases of several million people and simply pick and choose based on your criteria. And even better than that, we can adapt the hiring criteria because ultimately it's just a set of rules. It's just an algorithm that gets better over time. We can adapt it to the particular needs of the company. So the test is different for different companies. And the beauty in a place like India and China, where in the rat race to get ahead, everybody's cheating each other, right, is that our tests are cheat-proof. Because they change. You answer it. So Kisla and I could sit next to each other and take the test, and within, I think, 10 seconds, the test would be completely wildly different, depending on the responses. So we would not be able to cheat, right? But this has allowed, just in the last year, so this whole thing didn't exist 2 years ago, but just in last year, we've placed 25,000 people in jobs who are all poor people in white-collar jobs who didn't have a job. So I think these 2 kids from MIT have managed to touch 150,000 people in a short period of time and meaningfully change their lives because they now have white-collar jobs, right, from a poor village. And the only thing defining them in common is that they had no IIT stamped on their head because they came from backgrounds that were less fortunate. Anyhow, so I think with that example, it's a way of basically opening up the talent market completely. And I love Eric's. Eric is this gentleman's advisor, Eric von Hippo at MIT. I love his user source stuff because I think it's in the same direction. There's a guy in Japan right now, Kohei, who has created something called the Open Hippo Foundation, which you may want to find out about. And I'm an investor in the Open Hippo Foundation in a nod to Eric, who is a wonderful man, as a gesture of support for Eric's work. But he's basically creating a way to do an experiment. I'll give an example. He's doing an experiment at Lego, right? Lego, the company Yeah, I loved playing with Lego as a kid. But if you're somebody who plays with Lego and you come up with something cool, you can put it on his platform. And if other people like it, then Lego will pay you for the design rights. So that's systematizing user innovation, right, in a technological way. And so I'm trying to take it all across China and Indonesia and India now to basically spread it out. So anybody who wants to participate, write to me and I'll connect you with these people. So these are all individuals who are doing these crazy things in different places. And the advantage of coming to settings like this is that you bump into, I'm sure I'll get a couple of nice emails from people, suggesting people to talk to and so on. And I hope everybody does. So yeah, go ahead. So now we have real interactivity. We'll make it a real panel. Do you guys want to come up? You can come up too.
So I talked about these technology innovations, but if I'm honest, the thing that we struggle with is still the business model.
I was just saying that on the way out.
Like spoken web and so on.
Yeah.
So do you have some advice in terms of what's the way to...
Absolutely none. No, in all honesty, I would say that for any of these technologies, it's so hard to sit with a clean sheet of paper and figure out what's going to work. But what does work is just trying 50 different experiments with the technology, right? And the beauty is that I think, what's that old cliched saying is that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, or something like that, is that there's really nothing to stop. I was sitting and making notes when you were talking about many things I could think of. And they were all, that's how my mind automatically goes to saying, how can we use that to run an experiment that only costs $100 somewhere, that will increase the odds of my identifying whether its success rates are X or 2X or 10X, right? And then you iterate the experiments and you quickly converge to either failure or success. So I'm happy to share notes with you and see what comes.
So certainly one challenge that I want to share is also a lot of the mindset. Especially when you're working for a company like IBM, a lot of the mindset is still driven by a very Western centric. So sometimes when you are looking for, again, key decision makers, right? Figuring out what to do with technologies and so on, it's hard to convince some of these guys when they cannot relate to that.
So I'll give you an example that will be uncomfortably close for you, which is, let me illustrate. Actually, I don't know if I have, no, I don't have it here, unfortunately. Let me just talk through it. So, one example. There's a company I worked with for many years, a German company. It's a $100 billion retailer, wholesaler, Metro in Düsseldorf headquartered. Big presence in Asia, tiny presence in India. And what they do is they build these massive hypermarket type things, but purely for businesses. And they went into Vietnam, India, China, places like that, and began to essentially take the German model and plop it down in these places, right? Down to the silliness of saying, because we used to have roofs made in Europe to withstand so much snow, therefore all the roofs in Bangalore, Shanghai should have that much snow withstanding capability. And as silly as it sounds, this is a real example, right? Because somewhere in this big corporation, there was a rule written that you had to respect the protocol. And it was very hard to depart from the rule. There was too much bureaucracy to depart from it, so they kept insisting on it, right? The only time they deviated from it was when there was massive failure in some location, then they began to experiment and come up, right? And always it was a dialogue of the deaf between the country managers and headquarters in Düsseldorf. Düsseldorf saying, we know how to build it, you should do it the way we've done it because we're a $100 billion corporation and we succeeded, right? This sounds trite, but this is a real example, right? And the guys in Bangalore would say, well, to really make a wholesaler work, we need to provide logistics services, right? And they would say, we don't do logistics services. And you'd have this dialogue of the deaf, saying, stick to your knitting would be a common thing that you would hear, right, all the time. But that's not the reality of the emerging market space, right? I'll give you an IBM example with this same human resource company. So the Watson Labs invited these boys to come and present to them, right? I must have heard about it somewhere. And they said, oh, we must adopt it, and we should adopt it in India. But then they also said that the Indian guys have responsibility for, in other words, somebody in your outfit in India has responsibility for for saying yes or no. And the Indian guys say, no, Watson has to decide, or headquarters has to decide. And so you have this sort of back and forth, and it has to do with organizational complexity. I don't think anybody is trying not to do the right thing, but getting the right decision rights, the locus of decision rights done correctly is very, very difficult in even a modestly large company, let alone a behemoth like Metro or a behemoth like IBM. So it is tricky. So on the one hand, I'm saying there's experimentation going on everywhere, but to tap into the experimentation, you need to have the structure in place to be able to do it. And I think that's the point that Manish is also making, that it's hard to quite figure out how to get the business model up and running. We have time, Kisai? 10 minutes.
Just very quickly, I'm very intrigued by the healthcare answer that you're trying to do. I'm George Alayanis from Darden School. How are you? A big argument that is put forth is that basically we have to pay for all the R&D that we're doing. Mm-hmm. And if we don't have these expensive procedures, nobody's going to pay for R&D. And basically, healthcare will stop.
Are you talking about pharmaceutical drug discovery, or are you talking about procedures?
No, even procedures. So even procedures. So, to develop sort of a new procedure for heart, that will take, quite a bit of time to do and money. And so if we pay our surgeons, there's two questions in this. One is, we're going to stop basically having incentives to do this research, to produce these operations. And the second, I think, is, who is going to become a doctor going forward, which is, maybe in India with 1 billion people, you can find those who intern with Mother Teresa, but it's kind of, I guess that's the argument that comes from the other side.
So I'm very worried about creating the conditions so that we have the innovation flourishing in our institutions here, both as an academic and as an observer of some of these things. As a simple example, I started with that beating heart example, right? And I said that the surgeons here, I'm obviously simplifying and painting everybody with the same brush, but the median surgeon here would say that counts as too risky to do. And he's right. Given his experience base and the protocols in place, yeah, it is too risky to do. And superimpose on that the additional risk of litigation, that if something goes wrong when you deviate from established procedure, he's right. But that has to do with the conditions that have been created that are preventing that innovation. And I don't unfortunately know of any simple answer as to how, this is a complicated problem that far better minds than I have been trying to break down for years or even decades. Other than to say that when the circumstances are sufficiently dire and competition presents itself, I think there's a good chance that we'll see receptivity to doing things somewhat differently. So hopefully that'll be a piece of it, but I hope it doesn't have to be catastrophe before that happens. Yeah, the gentleman back there. There's a mic behind you. Yeah.
Good afternoon. My name is Stephen Hu. I'm a first-year MBA here at the Smith School. Thank you for coming today. You used the phrase Walmartizing this healthcare framework earlier. And I thought that was an interesting parallel because when we think of Walmart also, there are other effects that have been documented as well, turning into issues of asset specificity, for instance, in towns where a Walmart might wipe out smaller stores, but then there's this huge warehouse or store that if they leave, that there's nothing else left, and it creates a difference in bargaining power. And then there's all the different cultural aspects to whether or not that kind of model is good for society. When you think of Walmartizing this model and of healthcare in general, are there any challenges or fears or side effects that you foresee?
There's so many challenges that if one begins to enumerate them, it'll paralyze us. But really, the spirit with which I was using that term starts with a statistic. What percentage of people today in the world can afford heart surgery? Any ideas? Stephen, what percent?
Very high. Less than 10%.
The answer is 7%. 7% of people in the world. And of that 7%, probably 6.5% probably live right here. Right? And what I mean by the East Coast and West Coast, the nice parts of the US, right? So basically, we're talking about a situation, it's not that Walmart is coming in and replacing the mom and pop stores and creating all these social problems. It's like there are no mom and pop stores. So I don't really care about those problems because those are a good generation away. Right now, I care about 93% of the world that has no access to tertiary care at all, just providing them with some access. And frankly, it's just a way of motivating people and to get people to think outside the box and say, let's try something completely crazy. It's got to be completely crazy. It's not worth it. Ritu has a...
So your vision of $3 a year for healthcare, how do you see that play out, in terms of the business model again? Is it a single-payer system? What would the insurance structure look like?
No idea.
I think that's one of the issues that the US is struggling with right now. And it's not clear whether the same payment mechanisms would work in the less developed world versus the United States. And I think that's the 800-pound gorilla that people are not willing to address.
Yeah, I mean, there are 800-pound gorillas, and there's 200-pound gorillas, and there's a whole host of them in between. I'm actually not even remotely competent to address this issue because I don't have the domain specificity of knowledge that's needed to do it. What I do know is that we're sitting in this inefficient outcome currently, very costly, getting increasingly costly, right? That $100,000 cabin surgery is $106,000 this year, right? $109,000 next year. It's just spiraling out of control already, right? There, the surgery is going from $2,000 to $1,200 to $800 to $500. So something is amiss, and this system is still unwilling to embrace that, or even try it, because of all these issues that we're talking about, right? So, sorry, go ahead. Yeah. Yes, I know. Yeah. 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 Here meaning the United States. We can do that here. In a sense, he's right, because I'm just talking about one organization that's catering to a catchment area of ultimately still 50, 60 million people in India, plus a few more million through satellites and so on, right? So it's tiny. We still have 1.2 billion people to go. So in a capacity constraint sense, he's right? He's right because that's not available except in that particular locus. But if the general spirit of what President Obama said is that it's not possible to do it more cheaply anywhere else, frankly, that's baloney. And that's just the only word for it. So, last week we created a new healthcare company. I mean last week because at Harvard we have this Harvard-MIT business plan competition, which is insanely competitive, right? People come together from different parts and they think of crazy ideas to launch companies. At the end of it, there's a prize awarded, and people come to fund them. And they're basically people in their 20s and late 20s coming together to create interesting companies. The prize day before yesterday was won by one of my students for something that he came up with that I've been working on with him and with this hospital. And all it is, to cut a long story short, is it's a phone, right, with various things clipped onto it, right, that we can walk around the streets of Delhi and hand over to minimally trained doctors. Yeah? So this is a real company that exists, that we created 6 months ago. They walk around the streets and say to a general practitioner, if you see somebody with a strange-looking lesion on their hands or their face or in the oral cavity, take a picture. Yeah? Take a picture of it. And we will find, we use some encryption algorithms, very simple, off the shelf, nothing complicated, to zap that image back to a network of people that we've created that diagnose that with sufficient specificity of precision, not much, just enough to say you have a problem or you don't have a problem. And if you have a problem, come on in. The GP makes money. He gets, 50 rupees, $1, yeah, to administer the test. The diagnosing surgeon makes a couple of dollars, or the hospital actually more accurately. We keep enough to cover the cost of the thing, and we turn a profit, right? And we reinvest. We started with just basic basic lesions, cancer detection, oral cancer first, and other cancer detection, because the guy who first thought of it with us is an oncologist. And now we have 8 different conditions that we're doing, and we're just adding on little devices onto phones and walking around doing this. Something as simple as that. It is all off the shelf. And there's no reason why we can't do it here. It's all off the shelf. It's image recognition, which is interpreting the image, some encryption, which is commonly known for the longest time, zapping back over rudimentary transmission capacity, interpreting back using scarce capacity that's available. So now there's nothing that, now here we would have HIPAA that says you can't do that right away. So HIPAA says you can't do it. Then you have litigation for what if we diagnose it incorrectly and somebody, right? But the counterfactual should not be you diagnosed it incorrectly. The counterfactual should be that you didn't diagnose it at all and somebody died, and you don't measure that. So that's the trick. But in all this, what's happening, since this is an emerging markets conference, is that I'm sitting here in Cambridge, and I'm using the rest of the world as a lab because I can't run the experiments here. It's too costly. That'd be good? So I hope that gives you a flavor of some interesting things that are going on in different places. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Yeah.